In the dying light of another day, where the wine-dark sea meets the amber sky, a figure stands upon a distant shore. His eyes, weathered by salt and sorrow, gaze westward toward a home that exists now only in memory and dream. 20 years have passed since Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, first set sail from these very waters. 10 years he spent beneath the walls of Troy, where heroes fell like autumn leaves, and glory was purchased with rivers of blood. But those 10 years of war seem now like a gentle prelude to the 10 years of wandering that followed. A decade of divine punishment, supernatural trials, and the slow erosion of hope. The Mediterranean stretches before him, infinite and indifferent, its surface catching the last light like scattered bronze. This sea has become his world, his prison, his only companion. It has swallowed his ships, his men, his youth. It has carried him to islands where lotus flowers steal memory, where giants feast on human flesh, where witches transform men into beasts. The wine-dark waves have whispered to him of home while denying him passage, spoken of peace while delivering only peril. On this island of Ogygia, where time moves differently and immortal beauty dwells, Odysseus performs his daily ritual of longing. Each dawn finds him here, upon this rocky promontory, searching the horizon for sails that never come. The nymph Calypso, radiant as morning stars, offers him immortality itself, to remain forever young, forever loved, forever free from the burden of mortality. But even paradise becomes prison when it is not chosen, and the hero's heart beats only for the rocky shores of Ithaca, for the wife who waits and weaves, for the son who has grown from boy to man without his father's guidance. Nostos. The Greeks have a word for this deepest of human longings, this ache for homecoming that cuts deeper than any sword. It is not merely the desire for a place, but for recognition, for the restoration of identity, for the completion of the circle that began with departure. Odysseus carries this word in his bones, feels it in every heartbeat, tastes it in every drop of wine-dark spray that kisses his face. Far across these same waters, on the island of Ithaca, another figure keeps her own vigil. Penelope, daughter of Icarius, wife of the missing king, sits before her loom in the dying light. Her fingers, skilled as any goddesses, weave the threads of memory into patterns that tell the story of waiting. By day she weaves, creating beauty from the raw material of hope. By night she unravels her work, buying time with deception, keeping faith with patience. The suitors who feast in her halls, who consume her husband's wealth and court her hand, believe they are watching a woman weakened by indecision. They cannot see that she is performing the greatest act of heroism, the heroism of endurance, the courage to maintain fidelity when all the world suggests surrender. The tapestry grows and shrinks with the rhythm of tides, with the turning of seasons, with the slow revolution of years. Each thread is a prayer, each pattern a hope, each night's unraveling a declaration that the story is not yet complete. She knows, as only a wife can know, that somewhere beneath the wine-dark sky, her husband still draws breath, still carries their love like a flame that no storm can extinguish. Above them both, unseen but ever present, the gods watch this drama of mortal longing with the detached interest of immortals. Some, like Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, champion the hero's cause. Others, like Poseidon, earthshaker and lord of the seas, nurse ancient grudges and prolong the suffering. Between divine favor and divine wrath, between the pull of home and the prison of exile, between memory and hope, the last great hero of the Trojan War exists in suspension, neither fully living nor truly dead. The wine-dark sea holds all stories, all dreams, all fears. It has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of heroes, the endless cycle of departure and return that defines the human condition. In its depths swim the monsters of legend and the hopes of mortals. Upon its surface sail the ships of commerce and war, love and loss, adventure and return. It is the great stage upon which all Odysseys are performed, the eternal backdrop against which all stories of seeking and finding, losing and discovering, wandering and homecoming are told. As twilight deepens and the first stars appear like scattered diamonds upon the vault of heaven, Odysseus turns from his vigil. Tomorrow he will stand here again, as he has stood for 7 years, as he will stand until the gods decree otherwise. But tonight, as every night, he carries within him the unquenchable flame of Nostos, the certainty that every journey, no matter how long or perilous, must eventually lead home. The wine-dark sea sighs against the shore, eternal and patient, holding its secrets close. While immortals debated in marble halls above the clouds, below in sun-baked Ithaca, a young man felt the stirring of destiny in his bones, unaware that his father's patron goddess had chosen this moment to plant the seed of heroism in his heart. In the sacred halls of Olympus, where ambrosial light never dims and time flows like honey, Athena the bright-eyed stood before the throne of Zeus. Her aegis caught the eternal light, and her voice, clear as mountain springs, carried the weight of 20 years' observation. "Father of gods and men," she began, her words measured and purposeful, "how long must a hero suffer for the sins of lesser men? 10 years Odysseus spent beneath Troy's walls, fighting not for his own glory, but for the honor of his brother kings. 10 more years he has wandered the wine-dark seas, kept from his home by divine wrath that grows stale with time. Zeus, cloud-gatherer and lord of the bright sky, shifted upon his throne of storms. His eyes, which had seen the rise and fall of cities, the birth and death of heroes, turned to his daughter with the slow consideration of one who measures all things against eternity. "Speak, grey-eyed one, what would you have me do?" The Earth-Shaker's anger is not lightly dismissed, and Poseidon's grudge against the sacker of cities runs deep as ocean trenches. "But consider, Thunderer," Athena replied, her voice gaining strength like a rising wind, "the nature of that grudge. Yes, Odysseus blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, but was this not in defense of his men? Was this not the act of a hero cornered by a monster who devoured his companions like a beast? And if the son of Laertes revealed his name in prideful triumph, was this not the very human flaw that makes mortals precious to us? Their nobility is inseparable from their weakness, their greatness from their folly." Around the divine council, the immortal gods lean, steamed with the attention of beings for whom mortal drama provides relief from the endless monotony of perfection. Hera, queen of heaven, knew well the pain of waiting wives. Apollo, far-shooter and god of prophecy, had seen the threads of fate that bound the wanderer to his destiny. Aphrodite, golden goddess of love, understood the power of a heart that refuses to surrender its first and truest affection. But it was not merely divine sympathy that moved the council. In the great game of fate and free will that the gods play with mortal lives, Odysseus had become a piece too long held in suspension. Heroes are meant to rise, to achieve great deeds, to face their doom with courage, and then to pass into the realm of legend. They are not meant to languish in immortal captivity, their stories unfinished, their purposes unfulfilled. 10 years, Athena continued, is a full cycle of mortal time. A boy becomes a man becomes aged, a generation passes into memory. On Ithaca, the king's son has grown to manhood without his father's guidance, and the kingdom suffers under the weight of uncertainty. The suitors who feast in the halls of Odysseus are not merely unwelcome guests, they are parasites who threaten the very fabric of divine order. They mock the sacred laws of hospitality, they consume the wealth of a hero, they corrupt the institution of marriage itself. Zeus nodded slowly, his beard dark as storm clouds. The suitor's behavior was indeed an affront to the cosmic order that the gods maintained. Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality, was not merely a social custom, but a divine commandment. When mortals perverted this law, they challenged the very foundations of civilization. "And where is Poseidon now?" Zeus asked, though his divine sight already knew the answer. "Among the Ethiopians," Athena replied, "receiving their sacrifices, far from the wine-dark seas he turned, lames to rule. This is our moment, Father. While the Earthshaker feasts on burnt offerings and praise, we might grant the suffering hero his long-delayed homecoming." The divine council murmured its approval. Even among immortals, there was a recognition that some stories demand completion, that some heroes have earned their rest. Odysseus had proven himself in war and in wandering, in facing monsters and in resisting temptation. His fidelity to home, to wife, to the very concept of nostos had elevated him beyond mere heroism into something approaching the divine. "But he cannot simply be transported home," Zeus decreed, his voice rolling like distant thunder. "The hero's journey must be completed in the hero's own strength. We may clear the path, but he must walk it. We may calm the storms, but he must sail through them. The man who returns to Ithaca must be worthy of the kingdom he reclaims." Athena's eyes blazed with triumph. "Then let me go to the sun," she said. "Let me kindle in young Telemachus the flame of his father's courage. Let the boy become a man by seeking news of his father, by learning the weight of his inheritance, by preparing himself for the role he must play in the drama to come." And so it was decided. While Odysseus wept upon Calypso's shore, unknowing that his freedom was being debated in the halls of heaven, the gods prepared to set in motion the final act of his long Odyssey. The divine chess game that had held the hero in suspension for a decade was about to reach its climax. But divine justice, like mortal justice, moves slowly and with careful deliberation. Each piece must be placed with precision, each move calculated not merely for its immediate effect, but for its contribution to the greater pattern. The gods who had scattered Odysseus across the wine-dark seas would now work to bring him home, but the homecoming would be earned through trial, proven through suffering, and achieved through the hero's own unconquerable will. In the mortal world below, the sun set on another day of waiting, another day of longing, another day of the slow turning of fate's wheel. But in the divine realm above, the machinery of destiny had begun to turn, and the wine-dark sea would soon carry more than memory and dreams. It would carry the hero home. As the young prince sailed homeward with newfound purpose, carrying stories of his father's glory like sacred flames, far across the wine-dark expanse, those very stories were being born anew in the telling. For on distant shores, the wanderer himself had begun to speak. In the grey hour before dawn, when the wine-dark sea whispers its secrets to the shore, Telemachus, son of Odysseus, stood upon the harbour stones of Ithaca. 20 years old, with his father's strong hands and his mother's thoughtful eyes, he had lived his entire life in the shadow of absence. The young man who gazed out at the waters had known only stories of the hero king who had sailed away before his birth, leaving behind a kingdom, a wife, and a son who would grow to manhood orphaned by legend. But on this morning, something had changed. In his dreams, a figure had appeared, tall, grey-eyed, radiating the authority of divinity itself. The stranger's words echoed in his mind like bronze bells. "Son of Odysseus, how long will you endure the shame of lesser men? How long will you allow parasites to devour your father's legacy while you sit silent as a child?" Athena had come to him in the guise of Mentor, his father's old friend, but her divine nature had blazed through the mortal disguise like flame through parchment. Her words had awakened something in Telemachus that had slumbered for 20 years, the recognition that he was not merely the son of a missing king, but the heir to a heroic destiny. In the great hall of the palace, the suitors were already stirring, preparing for another day of feast and waste. These men, over 100 strong, had descended upon Ithaca like locusts, claiming the right to court Penelope while consuming the wealth of her absent husband. They were led by Antinous, proud and cruel, and Eurymachus, smooth-tongued and false, men who had forgotten that they were guests in an other's house, supplicants for another's wife. Telemachus entered the hall with new purpose burning in his chest. Gone was the uncertain boy who had endured their mockery in silence. In his place stood a young man who had glimpsed his own heroic nature and found it blazing like his father's own. "Men of Ithaca," he declared, his voice carrying across the hall with unexpected authority, "hear me speak. Too long have I endured your presence in my father's house. Too long have I watched you devour his wealth while dishonoring his memory. Today I sail to seek news of Odysseus, and when I return, I expect to find you gone." The suitors laughed, but their laughter held a note of uncertainty. This was not the malleable boy they had known, but something harder, more dangerous. Antinous rose, his face dark with contempt. "The whelp has found his bark," he sneered, "but barking dogs do not make kings, boy. Your father is dead, food for fish in the wine-dark sea. Accept it, and perhaps we will find a place for you in the new order." But Telemachus had moved beyond the reach of their mockery. With the help of Euryclea, his father's faithful nurse, he gathered supplies for his journey. The old woman wept as she packed wine and barley meal, remembering another departure 20 years before. "Your father sailed away with such confidence," she whispered. "Promise me you will return." "I promise," Telemachus replied, and in his voice was the echo of heroic oaths sworn by his father's generation. "But I must learn who I am before I can claim who I will become." The ship that carried him from Ithaca's harbour was blessed by Athena's favour, its sails filled with divine wind, its course set toward the sandy shores of Pylos. There, in the palace of Nestor, the old king who had fought beside Odysseus beneath Troy's walls, Telemachus would begin his education in heroism. Nestor, ancient and wise, his beard white as sea foam, received the young prince with the hospitality due to a hero's son. As they feasted in the great hall, surrounded by the old king's sons and companions, Telemachus heard for the first time the full story of his father's glory. Not the sanitized tales told by minstrels, but the raw truth of what it meant to be a hero. "Your father," Nestor said, his voice carrying the weight of years, "was the finest man I ever knew. Not the strongest, that was Ajax. Not the swiftest, that was Achilles. But Odysseus had something rarer than strength or speed. He had the courage to think, the wisdom to endure, the cunning to find solutions where others saw only problems. When the war seemed lost, it was Odysseus who devised the stratagem that brought victory. When the Greeks despaired, it was Odysseus who kindled hope." But Nestor's news was troubling. He had seen many heroes return from Troy, but of Odysseus there had been no word. "The sea swallowed him," the old king said sadly, "as it has swallowed so many good men. Yet I cannot believe that one so cunning, so beloved of Athena, would perish without leaving some trace." From Pylos, Telemachus sailed to Sparta, to the golden palace of Menelaus and Helen, the king and queen whose love had launched 1,000 ships and burned the topless towers of Ilium. Here, in halls that gleamed with bronze and gold, he would learn the most important truth of his journey. Helen, still beautiful despite the years, still carrying the divine radiance that had made her the prize of princes, looked upon Telemachus with eyes that held the memory of gods and heroes. "You are your father's son," she said simply. "The resemblance is so strong it stops the heart. I knew Odysseus well, too well, perhaps. He was the one man in all the Greek host who could see through my divine beauty to the woman beneath, who could speak to me without losing himself in desire. But it was Menelaus who brought the news that would change everything. The red-haired king, still bearing the scars of his battles, leaned forward with the intensity of a man sharing sacred knowledge. "Your father lives," he said, his words falling like stones into still water. "I have this from Proteus, the shape-shifting sea god himself. Odysseus is held captive on an island far across the wine-dark sea, prisoner of a divine nymph who offers him immortality if he will forget his home. But your father's heart remains true to Ithaca, true to your mother, true to you. The revelation struck Telemachus like a physical blow. His father lived. After 20 years of uncertainty, of wondering, of slowly accepting the probability of death, the truth blazed before him like a lighthouse in the storm. His father lived and suffered and yearned for home, just as his son yearned for him. That night, in the guest chamber of Menelaus's palace, Telemachus lay awake beneath coverlets of purple wool, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what he had learned. He was not the son of a dead hero, but the heir of a living king. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the joy. Helen came to him in his sleeplessness, bearing a cup of wine mixed with a drug that brought forgetfulness of sorrow. "Drink," she urged gently. "Let the pain ease for one night. Tomorrow you must carry this knowledge home, but tonight, let peace come to your heart." The drug worked its magic, and Telemachus slept without dreams, his young face peaceful as a child's. But when he woke, the knowledge remained, burning in his chest like a coal from the god's own fire. His father lived. His father would return, and he, Telemachus, must be ready to stand beside him when that day came. The journey home was swift, driven by divine winds and mortal urgency, but as his ship approached the familiar shores of Ithaca, Telemachus saw the smoke of signal fires and knew that the suitors had learned of his departure. They waited for him now, not with mockery, but with spears, determined to end the threat of the hero's son before it could fully flower. But Telemachus sailed on, undaunted. He had found more than news of his father on this journey. He had found himself, had discovered the heroic blood that flowed in his veins, had learned that some destinies cannot be escaped, only embraced. The boy who had sailed away in secret was returning as a man, ready to reclaim his birthright and prepare for the greatest homecoming in the history of heroes. The wine-dark sea carried him home, as it had carried his father away so long ago, as it would carry them both toward a destiny written in the stars themselves. And so, as night deepened over the peaceful Phaeacian shore, the greatest of wanderers drew breath and began to weave the tapestry of his suffering, starting with that moment when Troy's towers fell and the real journey began. In the great hall of Alcinous, king of the Phaeacians, the torches burned low and the wine-dark shadows gathered in the corners like listening spirits. The remnants of the feast lay scattered across the tables, bread broken in friendship, wine poured in hospitality, the sacred bonds of host and guest honored in the ancient way. But now the hall held its breath, for the stranger who had washed ashore that morning, naked and nameless, had revealed himself as the stuff of legend. Odysseus sat in the place of honor, his sea-scarred hands steady on the cup of wine, his weathered face calm despite the storm of memory that raged within. The Phaeacians watched him with the reverence due to living myth, for who among them had not heard the songs of Troy, the tales of the wooden horse, the stories of the man of many wiles whose cunning had toppled the greatest city in the world? The revelation had come slowly, like dawn breaking over the wine-dark sea. When Demodocus, the blind bard, had sung of the Trojan War, the stranger had wept with such profound grief that even the most callous heart would have been moved. When the golden-voiced singer told of the wooden horse and the fall of Troy, the tears had come like rain, and King Alcinous had known that this was no ordinary castaway. "Tell us, stranger," the king had asked with gentle courtesy, "why do these songs move you so? Were you at Troy when the great walls fell? Did you lose friends in that war, or kinsmen perhaps?" And then had come the moment of revelation, spoken in a voice that carried the weight of 20 years wandering. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. I am he of whom your bards sings, and every word he speaks is written in scars upon my heart." The hall had fallen silent then, as if the very air held its breath. Here was the hero of heroes, the man whose name was spoken in the same breath as Achilles and Hector, whose exploits had passed into legend even while he lived. But he sat before them, not as a conquering king, but as a broken wanderer. his glory tarnished by suffering, his crown replaced by the salt-stained rags of exile. "You honor me with your recognition," Odysseus continued, his voice gaining strength like a wind filling sails. "But I must tell you that the man who stands before you is not the hero of the songs. That man died at Troy, or perhaps in the years of wandering that followed. I am what remains, a survivor, a seeker, a man who has learned that there are fates worse than death and graces more precious than glory." Queen Arete, wise and beautiful, leaned forward with the interest of one who understood that true stories are found not in the bright surface of heroic deeds, but in the dark depths of human experience. "How came you to our shores, son of Laertes? What winds carried you so far from your island kingdom?" Odysseus smiled, and in that smile was both infinite sadness and unquenchable hope. "My lady, that is a tale that would take many nights to tell in full, but since you have shown me such kindness, since you have clothed my nakedness and filled my belly and promised me safe passage to my home, I will repay your generosity with the only coin I possess, the truth of my wandering." He paused, gathering his thoughts like a poet gathering verses, understanding that the story he was about to tell would be his greatest performance and his most terrible confession. For to speak of the journey was to relive it, to open wounds that had never fully healed, to confront the choices that had led him far from home into the realm of monsters and magic. "Know then," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of epic verse, "that when Troy fell and the Great War ended, I thought my trials were over. I had served my king, honored my oaths, played my part in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. All I wanted was to return to my island kingdom, to my faithful wife, to the son I had never known. The distance seemed small, a few days sailing across familiar waters. How could I know that the gods had other plans, that my real journey was just beginning?" The Phaeacians leaned forward, drawn by the power of his voice and the promise of wonders to come. They were a people blessed by the gods, living in peace and prosperity on their island paradise. But they hungered for the stories of the wider world, for tales of adventure and peril that would never touch their own blessed lives. 10 years I wandered," Odysseus continued, "from island to island, from wonder to terror, from hope to despair and back again. I have seen things that would drive lesser men mad, faced monsters that exist only in nightmares, been offered gifts that would make me more than mortal. I have drunk from the cup of immortality and found it bitter, held the golden apple of eternal youth and cast it aside. For what good is immortality to a man who has lost his humanity? What joy is there in eternal life when the heart yearns only for the mortal love of home?" He raised his cup, and the wine within caught the torchlight like liquid rubies. "I will tell you of islands where the sun never sets, and others where it never rises. I will speak of creatures that feast on human flesh, and goddesses who would make men their playthings. I will sing of the land of the dead, where I walked among the shadows of heroes and learned truths that living men were never meant to know." The king nodded solemnly, understanding that he was about to hear not merely entertainment, but sacred truth, the testimony of a man who had journeyed to the edges of the world and returned to tell the tale. "Speak then, noble Odysseus," Alcinous said formally. "Tell us of your wandering, and know that your words will be treasured as long as the Phaeacians remember the sacred bond between host and guest." And so, as the wine-dark night deepened around them and the torches burned low, Odysseus began to speak, his voice carrying them all back through the years to that day when the towers of Troy fell and the greatest journey in the history of heroes began. The middle phase of Odysseus's wanderings represents a systematic escalation of supernatural challenges that test not merely individual heroism, but the fundamental bonds holding human communities together. The scholarly analysis of these episodes must recognize their function as explorations of the psychological and social dynamics that emerge when conventional reality structures collapse under the pressure of extreme circumstances. The Aeolus episode embodies one of the most psychologically devastating patterns in the epic: the proximity of salvation, followed by its sudden withdrawal. The Master of the Winds, dwelling in his bronze-walled floating island, represents divine favor at its most generous. His gift of the leather bag containing all adverse winds should have guaranteed safe passage to Ithaca. The crew's decision to open the bag while Odysseus sleeps, believing it contains treasure that their leader intends to hoard, reveals the corrosive effects of prolonged hardship on social trust. The psychological realism of this betrayal deserves careful attention. The crew's suspicion that Odysseus has received valuable gifts while they remain unrewarded reflects the practical economics of heroic leadership. In the Bronze Age warrior culture that the epic reflects, leaders were expected to distribute spoils equitably among their followers. The men's inability to distinguish between material treasure and meteorological phenomena demonstrates how extreme circumstances can distort rational judgment. Aeolus's refusal to provide second assistance introduces the theme of divine favor as finite resource. The Wind King's declaration that the crew must be hateful to the blessed gods establishes the theological framework that will govern all subsequent encounters. Divine aid, once squandered through human folly, cannot be simply renewed through repeated supplication. This principle reflects sophisticated understanding of the relationship between divine justice and human responsibility. The Laestrygonians episode represents the most brutal and overwhelming defeat that Odysseus's expedition suffers. The giant cannibals, capable of hurling boulders like stones and spearing men like fish, embody the nightmare of encounter with utterly alien intelligence. Their coordinated attack on the fleet demonstrates that savagery, when sufficiently organized, can overwhelm even heroic resistance. The tactical elements of the Laestrygonians' encounter reveal sophisticated understanding of naval warfare. Odysseus's decision to moor his ship outside the harbor, while the rest of the fleet enters the apparently safe anchorage, proves crucial to survival. This precaution, maintaining a line of retreat even in seemingly secure circumstances, demonstrates the strategic thinking that distinguishes exceptional leaders from merely brave ones. The psychological impact of losing 11 of 12 ships cannot be overstated. The reduction of Odysseus's force from several hundred men to a single ship's crew represents not merely numerical diminishment, but the collapse of the social structures that had sustained the expedition. The loss of so many companions transforms the journey from collective adventure into increasingly personal ordeal. Archaeological evidence from various Mediterranean sites reveals the historical reality behind the Laestrygonians' portrayal. Neolithic and Bronze Age settlements in Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands show evidence of populations capable of sophisticated megalithic construction, yet apparently practicing ritual cannibalism. The epic's description of giants hurling massive stones finds parallel in the Cyclopean architecture that characterized these prehistoric cultures. The Circe episode introduces the theme of transformation that will become central to the epic's later development. The witch's capacity to transform men into beasts represents not merely magical threat, but profound meditation on the nature of human identity. The men who become swine retain their human consciousness while losing their human form, creating a condition of existence that is neither fully animal nor authentically human. The theological implications of the Circe episode extend beyond simple magic to encompass questions about the relationship between divine and human nature. Circe's status as goddess, daughter of Helios and granddaughter of Oceanus, establishes her transformative power as expression of cosmic forces rather than mere supernatural trickery. Her ability to reverse the transformation suggests that human nature, while mutable, possesses essential characteristics that persist even through radical alteration. Hermes' intervention, providing the moly flower that protects Odysseus from Circe's magic, represents divine favor operating through natural means. The moly, described as having black roots and white flowers, has been tentatively identified with various Mediterranean plants possessing psychoactive properties. This botanical grounding demonstrates how mythological narrative can preserve empirical knowledge while transforming it into universal symbol. The confrontation between Odysseus and Circe reveals the complex relationship between courage and cunning that characterizes heroic action. The hero's willingness to face the witch, despite witnessing his companion's fate, demonstrates physical bravery, while his use of divine protection and tactical advantage shows intellectual sophistication. The episode suggests that authentic heroism requires both types of excellence. The year-long sojourn on Circe's island raises profound questions about the nature of heroic duty and personal desire. The witch's hospitality, her sexual availability, and the abundance of her table create conditions that approach paradisiacal existence. Yet this apparent happiness coexists with the implicit abandonment of the nostos that gives meaning to the entire journey. The crew's eventual demand for departure, "It is time to remember your native land," represents the reassertion of collective purpose over individual pleasure. This moment reveals the complex relationship between leadership and followership in heroic culture. While the leader possesses ultimate authority, that authority depends upon the consent of those being led. The men's willingness to abandon comfort for the uncertain dangers of continued wandering demonstrates the power of shared cultural values. Circe's transformation from antagonist to ally illustrates the capacity for redemption that characterizes the epic's moral universe. Her provision of crucial information about the journey to the underworld, her warnings about the perils ahead, and her preparation of the necessary ritual materials demonstrate how former enemies can become essential helpers. This pattern reflects the diplomacy and alliance building that characterized actual Bronze Age political relationships. The prophecy that emerges from Circe's council, the necessity of consulting Tiresias in the underworld, establishes the theological framework for the epic's climactic revelation. The blind seer's knowledge of future events represents divine wisdom operating through human intermediary. The requirement that Odysseus journey to the realm of the dead to receive this knowledge demonstrates the principle that ultimate truth demands ultimate sacrifice. The ritual preparations for the underworld journey reveal sophisticated understanding of the relationship between life and death in ancient Greek thought. The specific requirements, particular animals for sacrifice, precise geographical location, exact sequence of actions, reflect actual necromantic practices that archaeological evidence has confirmed throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Homer's detailed description suggests either direct knowledge of such rituals or access to accurate traditional accounts. The psychological preparation required for the underworld journey extends beyond ritual purification to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of existence itself. The living hero's descent into the realm of the dead represents not merely physical journey, but profound spiritual transformation. The encounter with mortality that awaits will test not merely courage, but the basic assumptions that give meaning to human existence. The Nekia, or journey to the underworld, represents the psychological and theological climax of the Odyssey, functioning simultaneously as the hero's ultimate test and the epic's most profound meditation on the nature of human existence. The scholarly analysis of this episode must recognize its function as both narrative climax and philosophical centerpiece, examining how Homer employs the encounter with death to illuminate the fundamental questions that define the human condition. The geographical specificity of the underworld's entrance, at the confluence of the rivers Pyriphlegethon and Cocytus in the land of the Cimmerians, reflects actual ancient beliefs about the location of passages between worlds. Archaeological evidence from various Mediterranean sites reveals the existence of oracular shrines located in caves and chasms, believed to provide access to the realm of the dead. The epic's description of perpetual darkness and the absence of Helios's light corresponds to ancient cosmological understanding of the underworld as fundamentally opposed to the life-giving power of the sun. The ritual of blood sacrifice that enables communication with the dead demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the relationship between life force and spiritual consciousness. The requirement that shades drink blood to regain temporary speech and memory reflects ancient beliefs about the material basis of consciousness. This physiological detail, while mythologically expressed, preserves authentic, ancient understanding of the connection between physical vitality and cognitive function. Elpenor's appearance as the first shade to approach the blood pit serves multiple narrative functions while establishing the complex relationship between justice and compassion that governs the underworld episodes. The youngest member of Odysseus's crew, who died accidentally by falling from Circe's Voiceless, represents the tragic randomness that characterizes mortal existence. His plea for proper burial demonstrates how even accidental death creates moral obligations that the living cannot ignore. The Elpenor episode illuminates the ancient Greek understanding of the relationship between physical death and spiritual completion. The unburied dead, denied proper ritual treatment, remain trapped in a liminal state between life and death. Elpenor's specific request that Odysseus build a burial mound and plant his oar upon it reflects actual Bronze Age funeral practices that archaeological evidence has confirmed throughout the Aegean world. Tiresias's prophecy represents the theological center of the entire epic, providing divine revelation about the nature of fate, justice, and the relationship between human action and cosmic order. The blind seer's knowledge of future events demonstrates the principle that ultimate wisdom requires the sacrifice of ordinary sight. His blindness, traditionally explained as punishment for revealing divine secrets, actually represents the prerequisite for deeper spiritual vision. The specific details of Tiresias's prophecy, the cattle of Helios, the suitor's destruction, the final journey inland with the oar, establish the theological framework that will govern all subsequent action. The seer's warning about the sun god's cattle demonstrates the principle that divine property cannot be violated without cosmic consequences. His prediction of the suitor's punishment reveals the operation of divine justice through human agency. The prophecy's most mysterious element, the final inland journey until Odysseus meets people who mistake his oar for a winnowing fan, has generated extensive scholarly commentary. This episode, which lies beyond the epic's chronological boundaries, represents the hero's ultimate reconciliation with Poseidon through the establishment of cult worship. The transformation of the oar from instrument of sea travel to agricultural tool symbolizes the transition from wandering to settlement, from exile to integration. The encounter with Anticlea, Odysseus's mother, provides the epic's most emotionally devastating exploration of the relationship between heroic ambition and domestic obligation. Her death from grief during his absence demonstrates the hidden costs of heroic adventure. The hero's inability to embrace her shade, his arms passing through her incorporeal form, symbolizes the fundamental separation between living and dead that even filial love cannot bridge. Anticlea's account of Ithaca's condition, Laertes' withdrawal from public life, Penelope's faithful waiting, Telemachus's coming maturity, provides crucial information about the domestic consequences of prolonged absence. Her description of her own death, caused not by disease or violence, but by longing for her son's return, demonstrates how heroic actions generate ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate participants. The catalogue of heroic women that follows represents one of the most systematic explorations of feminine experience in ancient literature. Persephone's presentation of these shades allows Homer to examine the diverse ways that women participate in the heroic world, as mothers of heroes, as victims of divine desire, as agents of their own destinies. The catalogue's structure, each woman identified by her relationship to heroic men, reflects the patriarchal framework of epic tradition, while simultaneously revealing the complex agency that women exercise within these constraints. The appearance of Agamemnon's shade introduces the theme of masculine anxiety about feminine loyalty that will dominate the epic's final movement. The murdered king's account of Clytemnestra's betrayal provides explicit contrast to Penelope's faithfulness, while his warning about the treacherous nature of women reveals the psychological damage that betrayal inflicts upon masculine identity. His advice to Odysseus to return Retly and test his wife's loyalty establishes the strategy that will govern the hero's homecoming. The encounter with Achilles represents one of the most philosophically complex episodes in the underworld sequence. The greatest warrior of the Trojan War, now reduced to a powerless shade, delivers the epic's most devastating critique of heroic values. His declaration that he would rather be a slave to a landless man than rule over all the perished dead challenges the fundamental assumptions that justify heroic risk-taking. Achilles' regret about his choice of short life with glory over long life in obscurity reflects the mature Homer's complex relationship with traditional heroic values. The warrior who defined heroic excellence through his commitment to honor above survival now recognizes the limitations of that commitment. His concern for his son Neoptolemus and his father Peleus demonstrates how death transforms heroic priorities from personal glory to familial continuity. The silence of Ajax represents one of the most psychologically subtle episodes in the underworld sequence. The hero's refusal to speak to Odysseus, maintaining his anger over the armor dispute even in death, demonstrates the permanence of certain psychological wounds. His eternal silence suggests that some forms of honor, once violated, cannot be restored through any subsequent action or explanation. The vision of the great sinners, Tantalus, Sisyphus, and Titius, provides systematic exploration of the relationship between human transgression and divine punishment. Each punishment reflects the specific nature of the crime. Tantalus's eternal hunger and thirst correspond to his violation of divine hospitality. Sisyphus's futile labor matches his clever but ultimately meaningless deceptions. Titius's eternal torture reflects his sexual assault upon a goddess. The appearance of Heracles' shade introduces complex questions about the relationship between heroic achievement and divine favor. The hero's successful completion of the 12 labors, his apotheosis, and his marriage to Hebe demonstrate that exceptional achievement can transcend normal mortal limitations. Yet even Heracles maintains a shade in the underworld, suggesting that mortality leaves permanent traces that even divine honors cannot completely erase. The episode's conclusion, the pressing crowd of shades in Odysseus's terrified retreat, demonstrates the psychological limits of living contact with the dead. The hero's fear that Persephone might send the Gorgon's head to destroy him reflects the fundamental incompatibility between life and death that makes extended communication impossible. His return to the world of light carries the weight of ultimate revelation about the nature of existence and the price of heroic action. The post-underworld phase of Odysseus's journey represents the systematic testing of knowledge gained through encounter with death, as the hero applies prophetic wisdom to increasingly dangerous challenges. The scholarly analysis of these episodes must recognize their function as practical examination of the relationship between divine revelation and human implementation, exploring how theoretical knowledge transforms into effective action under extreme pressure. The return to Circe's island for Elpenor's burial demonstrates the complex relationship between heroic duty and practical necessity. The goddess's detailed warnings about the perils ahead, delivered in the liminal space between night and dawn, establish the theological framework that will govern all subsequent encounters. Her knowledge of the specific challenges that await reveals the network of divine communication that operates beyond human perception. The Sirens episode represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated exploration of the relationship between knowledge and destruction in ancient literature. The birdwomen's song, which promises comprehensive understanding of all things that happen on the fertile earth, embodies the fundamental tension between intellectual curiosity and survival instinct. Their claim to know all that the Argives and Trojans suffered positions them as repositories of epic knowledge itself. The technological solution to the Sirens' threat, binding Odysseus to the mast while sealing his crew's ears with wax, demonstrates the practical application of divine counsel. Circe's specific instructions allow the hero to experience the Sirens' song without suffering its fatal consequences. This episode establishes the principle that divine wisdom, properly applied, can enable humans to transcend normal limitations without violating cosmic order. The psychological dimensions of teams. Sirens' temptation extend beyond simple desire for knowledge to encompass deeper questions about the nature of heroic identity. The song's promise to reveal all that happens on the fertile earth represents the fantasy of omniscience that heroic achievement cannot satisfy. The hero's willingness to risk destruction for this knowledge demonstrates the intellectual ambition that both elevates and threatens exceptional individuals. The Sirens' location on a flowery meadow surrounded by the bones of previous victims creates a landscape that combines natural beauty with accumulated death. This juxtaposition reflects the epic's consistent association of intellectual and aesthetic pleasure with potentially fatal consequences. The detail that the Sirens' victims die not through violence but through neglect, forgetting to eat or drink while listening, emphasizes the seductive rather than overtly threatening nature of their power. The crew's response to Odysseus's frantic gestures during the Sirens' song reveals the complex dynamics of heroic leadership. The men's decision to bind him more tightly rather than release him demonstrates their understanding that divine wisdom sometimes requires overriding immediate desire. This moment illustrates how authentic authority depends upon the consent of those being led, even when that consent involves constraining the leader's apparent wishes. The Scylla and Charybdis episode represents the climactic test of heroic leadership, forcing Odysseus to choose between losing 6 men to the monster or risking the entire ship to the whirlpool. The unavoidable nature of this choice, no strategy can eliminate all risk, demonstrates the tragic dimension of command responsibility. The hero's decision to sacrifice 6 companions rather than hazard the entire expedition reveals the ruthless calculation that effective leadership sometimes requires. The geographical specificity of the Scylla and Charybdis episode, its apparent location in the Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily, reflects actual ancient knowledge of dangerous navigational hazards. The whirlpool's regular cycle, the rocky prominence that shelters the monster, and the narrow passage that permits no alternative route all correspond to real features of the strait. Homer's transformation of geographical knowledge into mythological narrative demonstrates the oral tradition's capacity to preserve practical information through supernatural story. The theological implications of the Scylla episode extend beyond immediate tactical concerns to encompass questions about the nature of divine justice and individual responsibility. The monster's status as daughter of various primordial deities establishes her as representative of cosmic forces that predate human moral categories. Her hunger cannot be satisfied or negotiated with. It simply exists as fundamental condition of the universe that heroes must navigate. The psychological impact of the Scylla encounter on both leader and followers deserves careful attention. Odysseus's decision to conceal from his crew the inevitability of losing 6 men demonstrates the protective deception that leadership sometimes requires. His later reflection on this episode, that watching his men die while calling his name was the most painful sight of his entire journey, reveals the emotional cost of command decisions. The crew's growing desperation and loss of faith in their leader's judgment becomes increasingly apparent as the journey progresses. Their willingness to challenge Odysseus's authority, their complaints about his decision-making, and their ultimate revolt on Thrinacia reflect the psychological deterioration that prolonged hardship produces. The men's transformation from loyal followers to mutinous subordinates demonstrates how extreme circumstances can dissolve the social bonds that normally sustain hierarchical relationships. The Helios cattle episode represents the ultimate test of discipline and religious observance under extreme conditions. The sun god's sacred herd, grazing on the island of Thrinacia, embodies divine property that cannot be violated without cosmic consequences. Odysseus's explicit warning to his crew that they must not harm the cattle regardless of their hunger establishes the theological framework that will govern the episode's resolution. The crew's eventual violation of the divine prohibition, driven by starvation after being stranded on the island by adverse winds, demonstrates the limits of human endurance when confronted with fundamental survival needs. Their rationalization that they will build a temple to Helios when they reach home reveals the psychological mechanisms through which people justify transgressing known moral boundaries. The supernatural portents that accompany the crew's sacrifice of the cattle, the hides crawling, the meat lowing as it roasts, establish the cosmic significance of their transgression. These violations of natural law demonstrate that certain actions carry consequences that extend beyond immediate practical concerns into the realm of divine justice. The crew's attempt to appease Helios through promised future offerings cannot cancel the immediate violation of cosmic order. Zeus's intervention through the thunderbolt that destroys the ship represents divine justice operating through natural phenomena. The storm's timing, immediately after the crew's departure from Thrinacia, establishes the causal connection between transgression and punishment. The complete destruction of the expedition, leaving only Odysseus alive, demonstrates the principle that divine justice, while sometimes delayed, operates with ultimate effectiveness. The hero's survival while his companions perish raises complex questions about individual responsibility and collective punishment. His personal abstention from eating the cattle provides technical justification for his escape, yet his failure to prevent his men's transgression suggests deeper questions about the nature of leadership responsibility. The episode explores whether leaders bear moral responsibility for their followers' actions even when those actions directly contradict explicit warnings. The second encounter with Charybdis, Odysseus clinging to the fig tree while the whirlpool destroys the wreckage of his ship, provides the epic's most vivid image of heroic endurance under impossible circumstances. The hero's patience, waiting for the whirlpool to regurgitate the ship's mast and keel, demonstrates the strategic thinking that enables survival when conventional heroic virtues prove insufficient. The ultimate isolation that results from the crew's destruction, Odysseus alone on the wine-dark sea, bereft of companions, ship and equipment, represents the complete stripping away of all external supports that heroic identity normally depends upon. This reduction to essential selfhood prepares the hero for the final phase of his journey, where survival will depend not upon martial prowess or strategic cunning, but upon the deeper resources of psychological endurance and spiritual resilience. 7 years had passed like a single breath drawn in paradise, or perhaps 7 eternities compressed into the space between one heartbeat and the next. Time itself seemed to bend and flow differently on Ogygia, where the nymph Calypso had woven her immortal enchantments around the greatest of wanderers, offering him a gift that mortal men had dreamed of since the first hero raised his sword against fate. Life without ending, youth without decay, love without loss. Yet here, in this realm where golden apples grew eternal and crystal streams sang lullabies to sleeping flowers, Odysseus sat each dawn upon the rocky shore, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the sand that the waves would erase, only to be drawn again with the patient persistence of despair. The wine-dark sea stretched endlessly before him, carrying whispers of home on salt-tinged winds that tasted of memory and loss. Calypso's beauty was terrible in its perfection, hair like spun starlight, eyes that held the depth of ocean twilight, skin that glowed with the soft radiance of pearl. She moved through her enchanted groves with the fluid grace of one who had never known the weight of mortality, never felt the pressing urgency of time's passage. Her love was vast as the sky, constant as the turning of seasons, yet it was precisely this constancy that made it a prison more secure than any bronze-bound dungeon. "My beloved," she would whisper as evening painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, "why do you torment yourself with thoughts of that distant isle? Here we could reign together through all the ages of the world. I offer you immortality, not the cold preservation of death, but the warm eternity of love. What more could any hero desire?" But Odysseus would turn his salt-stained face toward the horizon, where Ithaca lay beyond the curve of earth and dream. "Lady of the blessed voice," he would reply, his words heavy with the weight of longing. "You speak of forever as if it were a gift. Yet what is forever to a man whose heart beats with the rhythm of mortal days? Penelope's beauty fades with the passing seasons. Her hair grows silver with the years I have lost. But it is precisely this fragility that makes her precious, more valuable than all your deathless perfection. The nymph's immortal heart, unused to rejection, ached with a pain that had no name in the vocabulary of gods. She had loved before, dryads and sea spirits, the occasional mortal who had wandered into her realm, but never had she encountered a soul that could resist the promise of eternity. In Odysseus, she faced the paradox of mortal nature, that humans drew their strength not from the absence of death, but from its presence, hovering always at the edge of consciousness like a stern teacher whose lessons give meaning to every moment. Days blended into nights in seamless succession. The nymph would conjure feasts of ambrosia and nectar, entertainment beyond mortal imagining, conversations that spanned the breadth of history and the depth of philosophy. Yet always, inevitably, Odysseus would return to his vigil by the sea, his eyes fixed on the horizon where memory called stronger than paradise. In the deeper chambers of her crystal caves, Calypso would weave tapestries of their possible future, scenes of eternal love, of ages spent in blissful communion, of a world where loss was impossible because time itself had no power. But the threads would unravel even as she wove them, for she could not capture in her immortal artistry the one thing that gave mortal love its poignancy: the knowledge that it must end. The psychological weight of divine captivity pressed upon Odysseus like the depths of ocean. He was cared for, cherished, protected, yet these very gifts had become chains more binding than bronze. The hero who had faced the Cyclops' rage and sailed past the Sirens' song found himself defeated by kindness, imprisoned by love, trapped in a paradise that acknowledged no difference between blessing and curse. It was on a morning when the sea ran especially blue, touched by winds that carried the scent of wild thyme and olive blossoms, that Hermes appeared upon the golden shore. The messenger god's presence shimmed like heat waves rising from sun-warmed stone, his caduceus catching the light like captured lightning. Even in her timeless realm, Calypso felt the stirring of change, the approach of endings that even immortals could not forestall. Daughter of Atlas, Hermes spoke with the voice of divine authority. The will of Zeus has been made known. The wanderer's captivity ends this day. You must release him to his fate, as decreed by the one who rules over gods and mortals alike. Calypso's cry was like the keening of wind through empty halls, beautiful and terrible in its desolation. Is this the justice of the gods? To love truly, to offer the greatest gift within our power, and to be commanded to cast it away? I have harmed no one, threatened no divine prerogative. My crime is love alone. But divine will once spoken could not be turned aside by tears or argument. With the grace of one who had learned to bear loss with dignity, Calypso provided Odysseus with tools and materials for his departure. Together, they worked in the groves of her island, cutting timbers from trees that had grown in magical soil, binding them with ropes spun from immortal flax. The raft took shape beneath their hands, humble, mortal, fragile, yet it would carry him back into the flow of time, where storms could kill and hope could die. As he prepared to leave the timeless shore, Calypso spoke her final words of love and prophecy. "Go then, beloved of my heart, back to your mortal world of pain and ending. But remember, as you face the trials that await, that for 7 years you knew peace, and that in this deathless realm you are remembered with a love that shall never fade." The raft pushed off from the crystal shore, carrying its single passenger back toward the realm of mortality. As Ogygia faded behind him, Odysseus felt the weight of time settle upon his shoulders like a familiar cloak, heavy with purpose and possibility. Ahead lay the wine-dark sea, treacherous and magnificent, and beyond it, the distant shores of home where 20 years of absence waited to be healed. The sea god's rage had simmered in the depths for 7 years, patient as the tide, inevitable as the moon's pull upon the waters. From the deepest trenches where leviathans slumbered and coral cities grew in perpetual twilight, Poseidon had watched and waited, knowing that eventually the wanderer would return to his domain. The Earthshaker's memory was as vast as the ocean itself, and the insult of his son's blinding burned fresh as the day it was inflicted. When divine senses perceived the humble raft cutting through the wine-dark swells, carrying the hated mortal back toward the world of men, Poseidon's wrath erupted with the fury of 1,000 storms. So, his voice rumbled through the deep places where whales sing their ancient songs. The gods have freed him from the Nymph's embrace, but he still sails upon my waters, still breathes air that mingles with my domain. Let him learn what it means to defy the Lord of the Sea's rage. The god's trident struck the ocean floor with the force of earthquakes, sending shockwaves through the liquid realm that stretched from the uttermost depths to the foam-crowned surface. The very foundations of the sea trembled, and from the 4 corners of the world, winds came rushing at their master's call. Boreas from the frozen north, Notus from the burning south, Eurus from the dawn-touched east, and Zephyrus from the sunset west. Odysseus felt the change before he saw it, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the waves, a pressure in the air that spoke of coming violence. The sky, which had been painted in the gentle blues of morning, began to darken with unnatural speed. Clouds gathered from the horizon like an army of shadows, their bellies pregnant with lightning and their edges sharp as bronze spear points. Then the storm struck with the fury of divine vengeance unleashed. Waves tall as mountains rose from the depths, their crests for, aiming white as the teeth of sea monsters. The wind howled with voices that seemed to carry the screams of every sailor who had ever been claimed by the hungry waters. Lightning split the sky in jagged wounds that bled electric fire, while thunder shook the foundations of heaven itself. The raft, so carefully constructed with immortal tools and blessed timber, became a toy in the hands of cosmic rage. Each wave that struck it was like the blow of a titan's fist, splintering the careful joints, tearing away the ropes that held it together. Odysseus clung to the bucking craft with the desperation of a man who had sailed too far to surrender now, his hands bleeding from the rough wood, his body battered by the endless assault of wind and wave. "Poseidon!" he cried into the storm, his voice lost in the cacophony of divine wrath. "Your anger has followed me across the wine-dark sea for 10 years. Is your rage never satisfied? Will you pursue me even to the gates of death itself?" The god's answer came in the form of a wave, larger than any before it, a moving mountain of water that rose from the depths like a liquid avalanche, its shadow falling across the struggling raft like the darkness of doom. When it struck, the fragile vessel simply ceased to exist, its timbers scattered like leaves in an autumn gale, its passenger hurled into the merciless embrace of the storm-tossed sea. But even in the moment of his greatest peril, Odysseus was not abandoned by all the gods. Leucothea, the white goddess who had once been mortal and understood the terror of drowning, rose from the depths with compassion in her immortal heart. Her form shimmered like sea foam in moonlight as she approached the struggling hero, her voice somehow audible above the storm's roar. "Son of Laertes," she called, her words carrying the authority of one who had conquered the sea's terrors. "Cast off your remaining garments that drag you down, and take this veil, wind it about your chest, and fear not the ocean's rage. When you reach the land, for reach it you shall, return the veil to the wine-dark waters." The divine veil felt lighter than spider's silk, yet stronger than bronze as Odysseus wound it about his chest. With its protection, he found he could ride the mountainous waves like a dolphin, his body somehow buoyed by power that mortal flesh could never possess. Yet still the storm raged, and still Poseidon's anger pursued him through the chaos of wind and wave. For 3 days and 3 nights, the hero fought his battle with the sea. Without food, without fresh water, without rest, he rode the endless succession of waves, sometimes lifted to heights where he could see the curve of the earth below, sometimes plunged into valleys where the sky was lost behind walls of water. His hands grew numb with cold, his vision blurred with salt spray, his strength ebbed like the tide. On the 3rd dawn, when his endurance had reached its uttermost limit, the wine-dark sea began to calm. The winds, exhausted by their fury, fell to gentle breezes. The waves, satisfied with their display of power, subsided to rolling swells that carried rather than battered. And there, like a line of hope drawn across the horizon, appeared the green shores of Scheria, where the Phaeacians dwelt in their peaceful kingdom. With the last of his strength, Odysseus swam toward the land that promised sanctuary. The veil of Leucothea sustained him until his feet touched the sandy bottom, and then, as the goddess had commanded, he unwound it from his chest and cast it back into the retreating waves. The divine gift dissolved like morning mist, returning to the realm from which it came. Naked, nameless, stripped of everything save the essential spark of heroism that no storm could quench, Odysseus crawled from the wine-dark sea onto the blessed shore. He had passed through the ultimate test, the final confrontation with the god whose enmity had shaped his long journey. In losing everything, he had found the irreducible core of his identity, the hero who could not be broken by any force of nature or divine wrath. Finding shelter in a grove of olive trees, those sacred plants of Athena that promised wisdom and peace, he wrapped himself in fallen leaves and surrendered to the sleep of absolute exhaustion. The wine-dark sea lapped gently at the shore, its rage spent, its lesson taught. The wanderer had been stripped down to his essence, purified by ordeal, reborn through suffering into the final phase of his eternal journey home. Dawn came gently to the shores of Scheria, painting the olive leaves silver with dew and stirring the peaceful kingdom to life. The Phaeacians, blessed by the gods with prosperity and skilled in the arts of seamanship, had built their realm as a bridge between the mortal world and the divine, a place where heroes might find rest and hospitality before completing their destined journeys. Princess Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous, had been visited by dreams sent by grey-eyed Athena. In her sleep, she had seen visions of wedding preparations and the need for clean garments, prompting her to rise with the dawn and gather her maidens for a day of washing by the river. The goddess moved in subtle ways, weaving the threads of fate so that mortal actions served divine purposes, bringing the shipwrecked hero and the generous princess together at the moment appointed by destiny. The maidens' laughter echoed across the water as they worked, their voices bright as birdsong in the morning air. They had spread their washing on the smooth stones by the river's edge, their hands busy with the rhythmic work of cleansing, their hearts light with the joy of youth and companionship. It was their game of ball, played while the garments dried in the sun, that would wake the sleeping hero and set in motion the final act of his long Odyssey. When their ball went astray, landing in the deep pool where the current ran swift and clear, their cries of dismay pierced the morning quiet. The sound carried to the olive grove where Odysseus lay, stirring him from the deepest sleep he had known in 20 years. He woke like a lion disturbed in his den, his warrior's instincts alert despite his exhaustion, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings with the caution of one who had learned to trust nothing at first sight. The hero's appearance was terrible to behold, his body scarred by countless tears, his hair matted with salt and seaweed, his skin burned by sun and spray. Yet in his eyes burned the unquenchable fire of nobility, the light that marks those whom the gods have chosen to bear the weight of legend. Wrapping himself in olive branches to preserve the maiden's modesty, he emerged from his shelter like a creature of the wilderness, desperate yet dignified in his great need. The princess's companions fled in terror at the sight of this wild stranger, their voices raised in alarm as they scattered like startled deer. But Nausicaa stood her ground, recognizing in the suppliant's bearing the unmistakable marks of noble birth. Her father had taught her the sacred laws of hospitality, and Athena had filled her heart with courage for this moment of testing. "Stranger," she called, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Whether you are god or mortal man, I bid you welcome to our shore. If you are divine, I pray you look with favor upon our kingdom. If you are mortal, tell us your need, and we shall provide what comfort we can." Odysseus, master of words and wisdom, recognized the delicate moment that lay before him. Too forward an approach might frighten the maiden, too humble a plea might fail to move her generous heart. With the skill that had served him in council chambers and on battlefields, he wove his words like a craftsman working precious metal, each phrase chosen for its power to persuade and inspire. "Lady," he began, his voice carrying the musical cadence of one trained in the arts of speech. "I know not whether you are goddess or mortal woman, but your beauty rivals that of Artemis herself. If mortal, blessed are your parents who gave you life, blessed your brothers who call you sister, and thrice blessed the man who shall win you as his bride. Never have these eyes beheld such grace wedded to such courage." The princess felt a flutter in her heart that was not entirely the result of the stranger's eloquent words. There was something in his manner, a quality of suffering nobility that spoke of great deeds and greater trials. She had grown up hearing the bards sing of heroes, and now one stood before her, requesting nothing more than the basic courtesy that civilized people owed to those in need. "Come," she said, gesturing for her companions to return. "We shall provide you with clothing and food, and guide you to our city. But know that Sharia is protected by the gods, and our people are skilled in the arts of peace. If you come with violence in your heart, you will find no welcome here." The transformation that followed was like a rebirth from the sea. When Odysseus had bathed in the river and clothed himself in the clean garments provided by the princess, his true nature began to shine through the mask of suffering that had hidden it. Athena's divine touch enhanced his natural nobility, making him appear taller, stronger, more radiant than mortal men had right to be. Nausicaa's eyes widened with wonder and something deeper, a recognition that this stranger was no ordinary castaway, but a man marked by fate for great deeds. "If all strangers were like you," she murmured, "I would not fear to call one husband. But come, let us return to the city, where my father will receive you with honor." The journey to the Phaeacian capital was a passage through a realm that seemed touched by divine favor. The harbors were filled with ships whose speed and grace surpassed all mortal craftsmanship, their holds filled with treasures from across the wine-dark sea. The palaces gleamed with bronze and gold, their gardens blooming with fruits that knew no season, their fountains singing with waters that flowed from sacred springs. King Alcinous received the stranger with the magnificent hoe, hospitality for which his people were renowned. The great hall blazed with torches and rang with the voices of noble guests, while servants moved with practiced efficiency, ensuring that every need was met before it could be expressed. The king's throne was carved from ivory and gold, his crown set with gems that caught the light like captured stars. "Welcome, stranger," the king declared, his voice carrying the authority of one who ruled by divine right. "To our island home. Here, all who come in peace find rest and refreshment. Tell us your name and your story, that we might know how best to serve you." But Odysseus, skilled in the timing of revelation, requested permission to delay his tale until the following day. The customs of hospitality demanded that a guest be fed and rested before being asked to speak of his trials, and the hero recognized that his story would require the full attention of his generous hosts. That night, as he lay upon a bed softer than any he had known in 20 years, Odysseus felt the weight of his journey settling upon him like a familiar cloak. Tomorrow, he would speak his name and reveal his identity, setting in motion the final sequence of events that would carry him home to Ithaca. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Troy's burning towers, he could rest in perfect safety, protected by the most sacred laws of hospitality and the favor of the gods. The wine-dark sea murmured against the shores of Scheria, its voice no longer threatening but soothing, like a lullaby sung by a mother to her child. The wanderer had found sanctuary at last, and in the morning he would begin the final chapter of his epic tale, not as a beggar or a castaway, but as Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, the man whose name would be remembered as long as bards had voices to sing his glory. The Phaeacian ship cut through the wine-dark waters with supernatural grace, its hull blessed by Poseidon himself in the days when the sea god still smiled upon the island kingdom. No mortal craft had ever sailed with such speed or certainty, guided by divine favor and the skill of mariners who could read the ocean's moods like a familiar book. Odysseus slept in the stern, wrapped in purple robes that spoke of royal honor, while the cargo holds groaned beneath the weight of gifts that would restore his material fortunes along with his spiritual homecoming. Gold and silver, bronze tripods and fine woven cloth, amphorae of wine and oil, the Phaeacians had loaded their guest's ship with treasures that reflected both their prosperity and their recognition of his heroic stature. King Alcinous had declared that no hero should return to his homeland empty-handed, and the nobles of Scheria had competed in their generosity, each seeking to attach his name to the legend of the great wanderer's return. When dawn touched the familiar shores of Ithaca, the hero still slept, exhausted by the emotional weight of completing his tale. The Phaeacian sailors, skilled in the arts of discretion, carried him ashore like a precious burden, placing him gently on the sand beneath the olive trees that had shadowed his childhood games. They arranged his gifts nearby, then departed as silently as they had come, their ship disappearing into the morning mist like a vision from the realm of dreams. Odysseus woke to find himself surrounded by strange treasures on what appeared to be an alien shore. 20 years of wandering had taught him suspicion, and Athena's divine concealment made even his homeland seem foreign to his eyes. The olive trees were familiar, the curve of the bay held echoes of memory, yet doubt gnawed at his heart like a worm in fair fruit. Had the Phaeacians deceived him? Was this some new trial, some fresh torment devised by the gods who seemed to find endless amusement in his sufferings? It was then that grey-eyed Athena appeared, no longer in the guise of a mortal, but revealing her divine nature in all its terrible beauty. Her armor caught the morning light like captured lightning, her eyes held the wisdom of ages, and her voice carried the authority of one who had guided heroes through the darkest trials of their destined paths. "Son of Laertes," she said, her tone mixing affection with gentle rebuke. "Always you suspect deception, even when the gods themselves arrange your homecoming. This is indeed Ithaca, the island of your birth, the kingdom of your fathers. But 20 years have passed since you sailed for Troy, and the land you left as a young king has been transformed by your absence." The goddess's words fell upon Odysseus like cold water, washing away the scales of doubt and revealing the truth his heart had feared to acknowledge. This was home, but a home transformed by time and the corruption of weak men. The olive trees still grew where he remembered them, the harbour still curved in its familiar crescent, but the very air seemed heavy with the weight of disorder and injustice. "Tell me, divine daughter of Zeus," he asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "what has become of my house, my kingdom, my beloved wife? I hear no sound of ordered governance, no echo of just rule. What evil has taken root in my absence?" Athena's expression grew grave as she revealed the full scope of the disaster that had befallen his homeland. The suitors, young lords from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, had invaded his palace like a plague of locusts, consuming his wealth while pretending to court his wife. For 3 years they had feasted at his tables, drunk his wine, and plotted to divide his kingdom among themselves. Penelope remains faithful, the goddess assured him, but her situation grows desperate. The suitors press her daily to choose a husband, and her strength to resist them weakens with each passing season. Your son Telemachus has grown to manhood, but he is outnumbered and outmatched by the corrupt nobles who seek to claim his inheritance. The hero's hands clenched into fists as divine rage filled his heart. To have survived the Cyclops and the Sirens, to have endured the wrath of Poseidon and the temptations of immortality, only to return and find his home defiled by parasites and cowards, it was a trial that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Then let us restore justice to this land," he declared, his voice carrying the steel of absolute resolution. "But how shall we proceed? I am one man against many, and they have had years to establish their power." Athena smiled with the fierce joy of one who had waited long for this moment. "First, we shall hide your treasures in the sacred cave of the Nymphs, where they will be safe from thieves and time. Then I shall disguise you as an aged beggar, poor and powerless, so that you might enter your own hall without recognition. From this humble mask, you shall learn the true nature of those who have claimed your hospitality and plan their fitting punishment." The transformation was both physical and spiritual. Athena's divine touch aged his skin, bent his back, and dimmed his eyes until he appeared as just another wanderer cast upon the shores of fortune. His rich garments were replaced by tattered rags, his noble bearing hidden beneath the shuffling gait of one who had learned to expect rejection and scorn. "Go now to the hut of Eumaeus, your faithful swineherd," the goddess instructed. "He alone among your servants has remained true to your memory, protecting your interests and mourning your absence. In his humble dwelling, you shall find the loyalty that has vanished from your palace halls." The path to the swineherd's hut led through groves and pastures that echoed with childhood memories. Here he had run as a boy, hunting boar with his companions. There he had sat with his father, learning the arts of kingship and the weight of responsibility. Every stone and tree held stories of the man he had been before Troy's towers called him to glory and sorrow. Eumaeus greeted the supposed beggar with the automatic courtesy of one who had learned to see divine possibility in every stranger. The swineherd's face was lined with years of faithful service, his hands hardened by honest labor, his eyes bright with the intelligence that had made him valuable to his master and beloved by his fellow servants. "Welcome, old father," he said, using the term of respect that Greek custom demanded for all elderly visitors. "Rest here and share what poor hospitality I can provide. In these troubled times, all honest men must aid each other, for the gods may test us in any form." As they shared the simple meal of bread and wine, cheese and meat, Odysseus listened to the tale of his kingdom's degradation. The suitors had turned his palace into a brothel and gaming house, corrupting the servants with bribes and threats, intimidating the loyal citizens into submission. They consumed his flocks and herds with the voracity of wolves, while claiming to honor his memory and protect his interests. "My master," Eumaeus said, his voice heavy with grief, "was the finest king our island ever knew. Just in judgment, generous in victory, beloved by all who knew his worth. But 20 years have passed since he sailed for Troy, and no word has come of his fate. I fear he lies in some distant grave, his bones unburied, his spirit wandering homeless through the shadowy realm of death." The disguised hero's heart swelled with emotion at this display of perfect loyalty. Here was a man who had kept faith through 2 decades of uncertainty, who had protected his master's interests when lesser men would have sought their own advancement. In Eumaeus, he found the proof that not all virtue had fled from his homeland. As evening approached, the sound of approaching footsteps announced another arrival. Telemachus, now grown to full manhood, appeared at the hut's entrance, his bearing noble despite the weariness that marked his young features. The prince had inherited his father's height and his mother's thoughtful eyes, but his face bore the premature gravity of one who had been forced to shoulder adult responsibilities while still a youth. The reunion that followed was carefully orchestrated by divine wisdom. Athena's presence filled the humble dwelling, and father and son, separated by 20 years of absence, looked upon each other with the recognition that transcends mere physical sight. When the goddess revealed Odysseus's true identity, the transformation was not merely of appearance, but of understanding, as the broken threads of family were rewoven into patterns of love and purpose. Their tears mingled as they embraced. 20 years of separation dissolved in a moment of perfect reunion. The king had returned to find his son worthy of his blood, and the prince had found his father alive and ready to reclaim his throne. Together they began to plan the restoration of justice to their troubled land, knowing that the bond between them would prove stronger than any force their enemies could muster. The wine-dark sea whispered against the shores of Ithaca, carrying on its waves the promise of coming storm. The wanderer had returned, but his greatest trial still awaited, not in distant lands filled with monsters and magic, but in the familiar halls of home, Wixham. Ere the corruption of lesser men had created a wasteland more terrible than any he had faced in his long journey across the wine-dark waters of the world. The great hall of Odysseus's palace, once the center of just rule and generous hospitality, had been transformed into a stage for systematic corruption. The suitors had made themselves at home with the casual arrogance of conquerors, their voices raised in boastful laughter that echoed off walls that had once resounded with the measured speech of wise counselors and the grateful prayers of protected citizens. Antinous, foremost among the parasites, reclined upon a couch that had been carved for kings, his soft hands greasy with the fat of cattle that had been bred in Odysseus's pastures. His companions sprawled about him like satisfied wolves, their eyes bright with wine and the cruel joy of men who had taken what they desired without consequence. They had grown fat on stolen hospitality, their muscles soft from ease, their spirits corrupted by the belief that might alone made right. Into this den of indolence and vice came the beggar, his bent form and tattered robes proclaiming his apparent powerlessness. The disguised king moved with the careful shuffle of one who had learned to expect kicks rather than kindness, his eyes downcast in the manner of those who survived by avoiding the attention of their betters. Yet beneath this humble exterior, the mind of Odysseus worked with the precision of a master craftsman, cataloguing faces, assessing strengths, planning the restoration of justice to his defiled domain. "Another mouth to feed," sneered Antinous, his voice thick with wine and contempt. "Old man, this hall is crowded enough without adding beggars to our number. Seek your bread elsewhere, lest you find yourself thrown into the courtyard with the other refuse." But Penelope, watching from the shadows of the upper gallery, felt stirred by something indefinable in the stranger's bearing. 20 years of waiting had taught her to read the subtle signs of character that lesser souls might miss, and there was something about this beggar that whispered of deeper mysteries. She commanded that he be brought to her private chamber where she might question him about his travels and perhaps learn some word of her long-lost husband. The interview between the queen and the disguised king was a masterpiece of controlled revelation. Penelope's questions were probing but courteous, her manner suggesting a woman who had learned to hope for much while expecting little. She spoke of her husband with the reverence of one who had transformed memory into religious devotion, her voice carrying the music of love that had survived 20 years of testing. "Tell me, stranger," she said, her hands busy with the eternal work of weaving that had become both her solace and her strategy. "Have you in your wanderings heard any word of Odysseus, son of Laertes? They say he was skilled in the arts of war and wise in counsel, beloved by his people and feared by his enemies. Though hope grows thin with passing years, still my heart yearns for some sign of his fate. The hero's response was carefully crafted to kindle hope without revealing truth. He spoke of having met the king in distant lands, describing with perfect accuracy the man's appearance and bearing, his habits of dress and speech. Yet he maintained the fiction of his own identity, allowing his wife to believe that hope remained without claiming the full recognition that would have shattered his disguise. As they spoke, old Euryclea approached with a basin of warm water, intent on performing the ritual of hospitality that required the washing of a guest's feet. The ancient nurse had served the royal house since before Odysseus's birth, her gnarled hands having tended him through childhood's scrapes and boyhood's adventures. Her eyes, dimmed by age but sharpened by love, held memories that no disguise could completely fool. It was the scar that betrayed him, the old wound on his leg where a boar's tusk had torn his flesh during a hunting expedition on Mount Parnassus. The mark was distinctive, its shape familiar to fingers that had salved it and eyes that had watched it heal. When Euryclea's touch discovered this telltale sign, her gasp of recognition threatened to shatter the careful web of deception. "My child," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "you have returned to us at last. Oh, how I have prayed to see this day, to know that you lived and would come home to claim your own." Odysseus's hand moved swiftly to silence her, his eyes conveying the urgency of continued concealment. The moment of recognition passed unnoticed by Penelope, who had been momentarily distracted by the arrival of other servants. The secret remained safe, held in the loyal heart of one who had first held him as a babe and would protect him with her life. The evening's entertainment took a darker turn with the arrival of Iris, a professional beggar who had claimed the palace's charity as his exclusive right. The man's jealousy of the newcomer's apparent success with the household led to a challenge that the suitors seized upon as an opportunity for cruel amusement. "Fight him," Antinous commanded, his voice bright with the malicious joy of one who delighted in others' pain. "Let us see which beggar has the stronger claim to our bread. The winner shall feast with us, the loser shall be driven from the hall with blows." The contest that followed was a revelation in miniature of the power that lay hidden beneath the beggar's humble exterior. When Odysseus threw off his tattered cloak to reveal the muscled frame of a warrior, the suitors' laughter died in their throats. His shoulders bore the scars of a dozen battles, his arms showed the corded strength of one who had drawn the bow that no other man could string. The fight itself was mercifully brief. A single blow from the disguised king's fist sent Iris sprawling unconscious in the dust, his pretensions shattered along with his jaw. The suitors stared in amazement at this display of hidden strength, their wine-clouded minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. "By the gods," muttered Eurymachus, his voice tight with unease. "There's more to this beggar than meets the eye. Look at those shoulders, those scars. This is no common wanderer seeking charity." But Antinous, too drunk with power to heed the warning signs, saw only an opportunity to assert his dominance. Rising from his stolen couch, he seized a footstool and hurled it at the beggar's head, striking him a glancing blow that drew blood. The hall fell silent as the disguised king wiped the crimson from his brow, his eyes meeting those of his attacker with a look that promised future reckoning. "Now you see our true nature, stranger," Antinous sneered. "This is what becomes of those who forget their place in our hall. Remember it well, lest you receive worse treatment in days to come." As the evening wore on, Odysseus moved among the suitors like a shepherd counting his flock for slaughter. He marked each face, noted each cruel word, catalogued each act of injustice. Some among them showed flickers of decency, young men who had been drawn into the conspiracy more by peer pressure than by true corruption. These he would remember when the time came for justice to be tempered with mercy. But others, like Antinous and Eurymachus, had revealed themselves as thoroughly corrupted by their easy dominance. They mocked the servants, abused the hospitality they had stolen, and spoke of Penelope as if she were a prize to be won rather than a woman to be honored. Their words carved themselves into the hero's memory like inscriptions on bronze, each insult a debt that would be paid in full when the moment of reckoning arrived. The loyal servants moved through the hall with downcast eyes, their faces bearing the marks of those who had been forced to serve unwilling masters. Yet in their careful attention to the disguised king's needs, in their subtle gestures of respect and kindness, Odysseus read the signs of an underground loyalty that had survived 20 years of oppression. Eumaeus appeared at intervals, his presence bringing comfort to the beggar and unease to the suitors. The swineherd's devotion to his master's memory was well known, and his obvious care for the stranger suggested depths of character that made the corrupt nobles uncomfortable. They sensed in him a judgment that their consciences could not entirely ignore. As the night deepened and the wine flowed more freely, the suitors' true nature emerged in all its ugliness. They spoke openly of their plans to divide Odysseus's kingdom, their schemes to force Penelope into marriage, their intention to eliminate Telemachus as a threat to their ambitions. Each word was a confession that would serve as evidence when the time came for justice to be served. The beggar sat in the shadows, his eyes reflecting the firelight like those of a hunting wolf. 20 years of wandering had taught him patience, but now that patience was stretched to its breaking point, the corruption he witnessed was like a disease that had infected the very heart of his homeland, and he felt the weight of divine mandates settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of destiny. When at last the suitors stumbled off to their beds, gorged with stolen food and drunk on stolen wine, the hall fell into an uneasy quiet. The servants began their nightly task of cleaning up the debris of their master's indulgence, their movements efficient despite their obvious exhaustion. In their faces, Odysseus read the story of his people's suffering, the price that had been paid for his 20 years of absence. Penelope remained in her chamber above, her loom singing its nightly song of hope and despair. The tapestry she wove by day was unraveled each night, a strategy that had delayed the suitors' demands for 3 years, but could not be sustained much longer. Time was running out, and the queen's strength was failing under the relentless pressure of her impossible situation. As the beggar settled into his corner for the night, wrapped in rags that hid a king's heart, he felt the weight of the coming trial settling upon him like armor. Tomorrow would bring new humiliations, new tests of his patience and resolve, but with each passing hour, the moment of revelation drew closer, and with it the restoration of justice to his suffering land. The wine-dark sea whispered against the shores of Ithaca, its voice carrying promises of storm and cleansing. The wanderer had returned to find his home defiled, but he had also found that loyalty and love had survived the long years of testing. Soon, very soon, the bow would sing its song of justice, and the halls that had echoed with the laughter of parasites would ring with the music of restored order. The morning sun had barely touched the peaks of Ithaca when Penelope made her fateful decision. 20 years of waiting had taught her the art of endurance, but even the strongest heart has its limits. The suitors' pressure had become unbearable, their threats against Telemachus more direct, their consumption of her husband's wealth more brazen. The time had come to end the stalemate, though she knew not what ending awaited. From the innermost chamber of the palace, where sacred objects were kept safe from profane hands, she retrieved the great bow of Odysseus. The weapon was a masterwork of divine craftsmanship, its horn and sinew blessed by the gods themselves. Only its rightful owner had ever been able to string it, and only he had possessed the skill to send arrows through the line of 12 axe heads that served as the ultimate test of marksmanship. The bow felt heavy in her hands, weighted with memory and significance. She remembered the day her husband had first demonstrated its power, how the other nobles had watched in amazement as arrow after arrow found its mark with supernatural precision. The weapon had been both symbol and proof of his fitness to rule, a physical manifestation of the divine favor that rested upon the house of Laertes. "Hear me, "You who have consumed my household and claimed my husband's place," she announced to the assembled suitors, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years of patient suffering. "Today I shall choose among you, but not through words or gifts. Let he who can string this bow and shoot an arrow through the 12 axe heads prove himself worthy to be called my husband and your king." The suitors received her challenge with a mixture of excitement and unease. Here at last was the prize they had sought for so long, yet the test itself awakened memories of stories told about the bow's legendary difficulty. Still, each Anne was confident in his own strength, certain that what one mortal had accomplished, another could surely match. Antinous stepped forward first, his soft hands closing around the horn grip with the confidence of one who had never known defeat. He had practiced archery in his youth, had won contests against lesser men, and believed that strength alone would be sufficient to master the weapon. But when he attempted to bend the bow, his face reddened with strain, his muscles trembled with effort, and still the stubborn horn refused to yield. One by one, the other suitors made their attempts. Eurymachus, skilled in the arts of flattery and deception, found that neither smooth words nor cunning strategy could convince the bow to submit to his will. Amphinomus, strongest among their number, succeeded only in snapping the string when he applied too much force too quickly. Each failure brought nervous laughter from the others, but also growing unease as they realized the magnitude of the challenge they faced. The beggar watched from his corner, his eyes reflecting the firelight, like those of a patient predator. 20 years of wandering had taught him the value of perfect timing, and he recognized that the moment of revelation was approaching. The bow was calling to him across the hall, its voice audible only to the ears of its rightful master. "Lords," he said, his voice carrying the humble tone of one who knew his place. "Might a poor wanderer make a request? I have handled such weapons in my youth before fortune turned against me. Perhaps you would allow me to test my strength against this famous bow." The suitor's reaction was immediate and violent. The idea that a beggar might succeed where they had failed was an insult to their pride, a challenge to the natural order as they understood it. Antinous's face darkened with rage, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. "Fool," he snarled, his voice thick with wine and anger. "Do you think to make sport of your betters? This bow has defeated the strongest men in the kingdom. What hope could a ragged wanderer have of succeeding where his superiors have failed?" But Penelope, moved by some impulse she could not name, spoke in the beggar's defense. "Let him try," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of 20 years as queen. "What harm can come of it? If he succeeds, I shall reward him richly. If he fails, we shall have lost nothing but a moment's time." Eumaeus, his weathered face bright with hope he dared not acknowledge, brought the bow to his disguised master. The swineherd's hands trembled as he placed the weapon in the beggar's grasp, his eyes searching the stranger's face for some sign of the truth his heart suspected, but his mind refused to accept. When Odysseus's fingers closed around the familiar grip, 20 years of separation vanished in an instant. The bow recognized its master's touch, its resistance melting away like ice in spring sunshine. The hero's hands moved with the practiced efficiency of one who had performed this action 1,000 times, his muscles remembering the precise tension required to bend the stubborn horn. The bowstring sang as he fitted it to its notch, the sound pure and clear as a temple bell. The suitors fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats as they watched the impossible unfold before their eyes. This was no mere display of strength, but a reunion between warrior and weapon, a restoration of the natural order that had been disrupted by 20 years of chaos. The 12 axe heads stood in their appointed line, their bronze blades gleaming in the firelight. The shot required was beyond the skill of ordinary archers, demanding not merely strength, but perfect precision, absolute control, and the favor of the gods themselves. He was a test that only one man in all the world could hope to pass. Odysseus drew the string back to his ear, his stance betraying the trained grace of one who had learned archery from divine teachers. The arrow knocked against the string seemed to quiver with anticipation, eager to fly toward its destined mark. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the hall held its breath, suspended between one age and the next. Then the string released with a sound like thunder, and the arrow flew true as divine justice itself. It passed through the eye of the first axe head, then the second, then the third, each passage as smooth as silk drawn through a needle's eye. The bronze sang as the shaft passed through, creating a music that had not been heard in the halls of Ithaca for 20 years. When the arrow emerged from the 12th axe head and buried itself in the wall beyond, the silence that followed was profound as the grave. The suitors stared in amazement and growing terror as the truth began to dawn upon their wine-clouded minds. No beggar could have made such a shot. No common man could have strung the bow that had defeated their greatest champions. The beggar rose from his corner, and as he did so, the years seemed to fall away from his shoulders like a discarded cloak. His back straightened, his eyes blazed with the fire of divine purpose, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of rightful kingship. "Now," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade, "let us see if I can hit a target that has never been struck before." The second arrow was already nocked, its point aimed at the heart of Antinous. The suitor's eyes widened in recognition and terror as he realized that his hour of reckoning had come. The bow sang again, and justice, so long delayed, finally found its mark. The arrow struck Antinous in the throat as he raised a golden cup to his lips, the wine spilling across his chest like blood as he toppled backward from his stolen throne. The cup rolled across the floor, its contents mixing with the crimson that poured from the wound, creating a pool that reflected the firelight like a mirror of divine judgment. For a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, the hall remained frozen in tableau, the suitors staring in disbelief at their fallen leader, the disguised king standing with bow in hand, the arrows fletching still quivering from the force of its passage. Then chaos erupted as the full magnitude of the moment crashed upon them, like a wave breaking against stone. "Murder!" screamed Eurymachus, his voice cracking with terror as he scrambled for his sword. "The beggar has killed Antinous! Seize him! Strike him down!" But Odysseus was already moving, his hands swift and sure as he nocked another arrow. The bow sang again, and Eurymachus joined his companion in death, the bronze point taking him through the chest as he struggled to draw his weapon. The hero's voice rose above the chaos, carrying the authority of divine justice and long-delayed vengeance. "You dogs!" he roared, his words echoing off the walls like thunder. "You who have devoured my substance, dishonored my house, and sought to steal my wife. You thought Odysseus would never return from Troy, and so you grew bold in your villainy. But I have come home at last, and your hour of reckoning has arrived." The revelation hit the surviving suitors like a physical blow. The beggar's transformation was complete. Gone was the bent old man who had pleaded for scraps, replaced by the figure they had heard described in countless songs. Here stood Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, his bow singing its song of justice after 20 years of silence. Some among them fell to their knees, their hands raised in supplication as they begged for mercy. Leodes, the prophet who had always counseled against their worst excesses, threw himself upon the ground and clasped the hero's knees in the ancient gesture of supplication. "Mercy, Lord Odysseus," he cried, his voice broken with fear and genuine remorse. "I was not as the others. I counseled them against their evil ways, tried to restrain their appetites, opposed their plans to harm your son. By the gods, I swear I never touched your wife with lustful thoughts or participated in their vilest schemes." But the hero's heart was harder than bronze. tempered by 20 years of suffering and the sight of his home's defilement. "If you were indeed their prophet," he replied, his voice cold as winter wind, "then you must have prayed often for my death, that you might enjoy the fruits of my absence. No mercy shall you find here." The third arrow found its mark, and the prophet's pleas died with him. Around the hall, the remaining suitors scrambled for weapons, overturning tables and benches in their desperation to reach the armor they had foolishly left in their chambers. But Telemachus was already moving, his young limbs carrying him swiftly to his father's side. "Father," he called, his voice ringing with joy and determination. "I shall bring spears and shields, armor for us both. These cowards shall not escape the justice they have earned through their corruption of our house." The prince returned swiftly, his arms laden with weapons that gleamed like captured starlight. He armed himself with practiced efficiency, then helped his father don the bronze that had protected him through countless battles. Behind them, the loyal servants moved to bar the doors, ensuring that none of the guilty could escape to carry word of their master's return. Eumaeus and Philoetius, the faithful swineherd and cowherd, took up their own weapons with the grim satisfaction of men who had waited long for this moment. They had endured years of insult and abuse from the suitors, had watched helplessly as their master's property was devoured and his household corrupted. Now they would stand beside their rightful king and help him cleanse the poison from his realm. The battle that followed was less a fight than an execution. The suitors, soft from years of indulgence and taken completely by surprise, proved no match for the hero who had sacked Troy and survived the wrath of gods. Odysseus moved among them like a force of nature, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision, each blow guided by divine justice and righteous anger. Some tried to flee, only to find the doors barred against them. Others attempted to organize resistance, but their soft muscles and wine-clouded minds could not match the skill of hardened warriors. The hall that had echoed with their laughter and boasting now rang with their death cries, the floor growing slick with blood as justice claimed its due. Athena herself appeared in the battle's midst, her presence felt rather than seen as she guided her champion's weapons and turned aside the desperate attacks of the doomed men. The goddess had waited 20 years for this moment, and her grey eyes blazed with satisfaction as she watched the restoration of order to the house she had always favoured. One by one, the suitors fell until only Phemius the bard and Medon the herald remained alive among the carnage. These two had served the corrupt nobles from necessity rather than choice, their skills making them valuable to men who cared nothing for their loyalty. They cowered in the corner, their faces pale with terror as they awaited their fate. "Spare us, Lord," Phemius pleaded, his voice the same that Hall had sung the praises of heroes in happier days. "We served them only because we must, not from love of their evil ways. A bard must sing for those who command his voice, and a herald must speak the words his masters require." Telemachus stepped forward, his young face grave with newfound wisdom. "Father," he said, "these men speak truth. They served the suitors from compulsion, not choice. Let mercy temper justice in their case, that men might know you do not slay the innocent with the guilty." The king's stern expression softened slightly as he looked upon his son's face. Here was wisdom that came not from experience but from natural nobility, the quality that would make Telemachus a ruler worthy of his inheritance. "Let them live," he decided, "but let them depart from this hall and never return. They have witnessed justice done, and their songs shall carry the tale to other lands." The two survivors fled gratefully, their feet hardly touching the blood-soaked floor in their haste to escape. Behind them, the hall fell silent, except for the crackling of torches and the drip of blood from bronze-tipped spears. The reckoning was complete, but the work of restoration had only begun. The unfaithful servants who had betrayed their master's trust were brought forward, their faces marked with the guilt of those who had chosen comfort over loyalty. Melanthius, the goatherd who had mocked the disguised king and aided the suitors in their villainy, received the punishment his treachery had earned. The serving women who had shared the suitors' beds and betrayed their mistress's honor were led away to face the judgment that their actions had made inevitable. Then came the cleansing of the hall itself, the purification that would restore sanctity to the defiled space. Fire and sulfur, salt and sacred water, all the elements of ritual cleansing were brought to bear upon the bloodster. Inid stones, the loyal servants worked with tears of joy streaming down their faces, their hearts lifted by the knowledge that their true master had returned at last. When the great hall had been cleansed and made ready for righteous rule, Odysseus stood among his faithful servants and looked upon what had been accomplished. Justice had been served, order had been restored, and the natural hierarchy of his kingdom had been re-established. Yet one trial remained, the greatest and most difficult of all. Somewhere above, in the chambers that had been her prison for 20 years, Penelope waited. The sounds of battle had surely reached her ears, but would she believe the impossible truth? Could 20 years of faithful waiting be rewarded with the recognition her heart both craved and feared? The bow had sung its song of justice, and the arrows had found their marks. Now it remained to be seen whether the music of restored love could heal the wounds that time and separation had carved upon two hearts that had been forced to endure the cruelest test of all, the test of hope deferred and love that must survive on memory alone. The wine-dark sea whispered against the shores of Ithaca, its voice carrying the promise of peace restored and order renewed. The wanderer had returned, the king had reclaimed his throne, and the halls of justice rang once more with the sounds of righteous rule. But the greatest homecoming still awaited, and with it the final proof that love, like justice, could survive any trial the gods might devise. The culminating recognition scene between Odysseus and Penelope represents Homer's most sophisticated exploration of marital intimacy as epistemological validation. After 20 years of enforced separation, the poet constructs a recognition mechanism that transcends physical identification, delving into the metaphysical territory of shared domestic knowledge that constitutes authentic conjugal bond. Penelope's initial skepticism emerges not from feminine caprice, but from the accumulated psychological trauma of 2 decades spent navigating between hope and despair. Her methodical skepticism represents a scholarly approach to verification. She has endured countless false reports, fraudulent claimants, and the cruel optimism of unfounded rumors. The text reveals her as a figure of intellectual rigor, demanding empirical proof rather than accepting emotional testimony. The test of the marriage bed functions as the narrative's most profound symbolic construct. Homer's genius lies in selecting not merely any domestic detail, but the foundational architectural element that literally roots their union in living organic matter. The olive tree, carved in situ to form the bedpost, represents marriage as natural growth rather than artificial construction. This botanical metaphor suggests that authentic marital bonds develop from living, rooted foundations rather than portable, transferable arrangements. When Odysseus provides the detailed architectural description, the olive tree's natural incorporation, the specific construction techniques, the chamber's precise dimensions, he demonstrates knowledge that transcends mere observation. This constitutes testimonial evidence of the most intimate variety, domestic archaeology that only a true inhabitant could possess. The bed's secret nature reinforces the exclusivity of marital knowledge, information safeguarded within the sacred prex, inked of conjugal intimacy. The recognition scene itself unfolds with extraordinary psychological realism. Penelope's emotional barriers dissolve not through dramatic gesture, but through the accumulation of incontrovertible domestic evidence. Her tears represent not mere emotional release, but the intellectual satisfaction of verified truth. The reunion transcends romantic sentiment to become epistemological confirmation. the restoration of shared knowledge that defines authentic relationship. Athena's intervention, extending the night to accommodate their reunion, represents divine acknowledgement of marriage's sacred significance. This temporal manipulation suggests that genuine conjugal reunion requires suspension of ordinary chronology, creating sacred time for the restoration of broken intimacy. The goddess's gift acknowledges that some human experiences demand supernatural accommodation. The subsequent exchange of parallel narratives, Odysseus recounting his wanderings, Penelope describing her domestic siege, creates symmetrical suffering that validates both spouses' fidelity. Their stories interweave like the threads of Penelope's tapestry, creating a shared text of endurance that becomes the foundation for renewed intimacy. This narrative reciprocity suggests that marriage consists not merely in physical reunion, but in the mutual recognition of parallel suffering and complementary faithfulness. The bed as symbol extends beyond domestic architecture to represent the immutable foundation of civilized society. Unlike portable furniture, this rooted construction cannot be moved without destroying its essential nature. Similarly, authentic marriage creates institutional stability that provides the bedrock for social order. The olive tree's continued growth suggests that genuine marital bonds strengthen rather than deteriorate through time. Homer's treatment of conjugal recognition establishes marriage as the ultimate test of identity verification. While Odysseus can prove his heroic credentials through physical prowess, demonstrating his worth as husband requires accessing the most private archive of shared domestic experience. This epistemological framework suggests that authentic identity emerges not from public achievement, but from intimate knowledge validated through mutual recognition. The restoration of marital intimacy completes Odysseus's transformation from wandering hero to settled king. His journey's true completion occurs not in reclaiming his throne, but in resuming his role as husband. This hierarchical arrangement suggests that domestic relationships provide the foundational identity from which public roles derive their meaning and authority. The final confrontation between Odysseus and the suitors' families represents Homer's sophisticated meditation on the cyclical nature of violence and the divine mechanisms required to interrupt hereditary vengeance. This episode functions as the narrative's crucial examination of how justice, once initiated, threatens to perpetuate itself through generational retaliation unless interrupted by supernatural intervention. Eupeithes' leadership of the grieving fathers establishes the legitimate foundation of their grievance. From their perspective, Odysseus represents not heroic justice, but aristocratic violence, a king who slaughtered their sons without legal process or opportunity for recompense. Their emotional response emerges from the fundamental human drive to avenge familial loss, creating a moral complexity that transcends simple heroic vindication. The convergence of three generations, Laertes, Odysseus, and Telemachus, creates a symbolic representation of dynastic continuity under threat. Laertes' transformation from aged withdrawal to renewed martial vigor suggests that family honor transcends individual mortality. His rejuvenation through reunion with his son demonstrates how generational connection provides the psychological foundation for continued resistance. The arming of Laertes represents more than military preparation. It constitutes a ritual restoration of heroic identity. His donning of armor becomes a ceremonial return to his earlier heroic status, suggesting that authentic nobility remains dormant rather than disappearing through age or circumstance. This transformation validates the principle that heroic excellence constitutes a permanent characteristic rather than temporary achievement. The tactical preparation for battle reveals the systematic nature of heroic warfare. Unlike the spontaneous violence in the Great Hall, this confrontation requires strategic planning, alliance formation, and coordinated defense. The careful positioning of loyal servants and the securing of defensive positions demonstrates that legitimate authority must be prepared to defend itself through organized resistance. Athena's decisive intervention represents the culmination of divine justice theory throughout the epic. Her appearance in battle provides supernatural validation of Odysseus's cause while simultaneously demonstrating the limits of human agency. The goddess's participation suggests that certain conflicts require divine resolution because human mechanisms prove insufficient to establish definitive justice. Zeus's thunderbolt serves as the ultimate divine pronouncement, ending the cycle of vengeance through supernatural command rather than human negotiation. This meteorological intervention represents the restoration of cosmic order through divine fiat, suggesting that some conflicts transcend human resolution capacity. The thunderbolt's symbolic significance extends beyond mere military intervention to represent the re-establishment of natural law. The subsequent Treaty of Reconciliation creates institutional mechanisms for preventing future violence. Unlike mere cessation of hostilities, this agreement establishes formal procedures for resolving disputes within legal frameworks rather than through hereditary retaliation. The peace treaty's binding nature suggests that lasting social stability requires institutional structures rather than individual restraint. The community's healing process involves not merely ending immediate violence, but addressing the underlying social disruption caused by the suitor's extended occupation. The restoration of normal social relationships requires systematic rebuilding of trust, legal authority, and economic stability. This comprehensive reconciliation demonstrates that authentic justice extends beyond punishment to include social reconstruction. The divine resolution emphasizes that human wisdom alone cannot interrupt the cycle of retributive violence. Without supernatural intervention, the conflict would continue through successive generations, creating perpetual instability. The gods' active involvement suggests that lasting peace requires transcendent authority, capable of imposing resolution beyond human capacity for forgiveness or restraint. The narrative's conclusion within the Phaeacian court represents Homer's sophisticated metatextual meditation on the relationship between lived experience and artistic representation. Odysseus's role as narrator of his own adventures creates a complex epistemological framework wherein the hero becomes simultaneously the subject and object of epic discourse, embodying the tension between historical actuality and poetic transformation. The Phaeacians' response to Odysseus's completed narrative functions as a paradigmatic representation of the ideal audience for heroic poetry. Their wonder emerges not from mere entertainment, but from recognition of the story's universal significance. Their generous response, providing safe passage and abundant gifts, suggests that authentic storytelling creates reciprocal obligations between narrator and audience, establishing community through shared recognition of heroic truth. The thematic architecture of the completed narrative reveals Homer's systematic exploration of fundamental human concerns. The concept of nostos transcends mere geographical return to encompass the psychological restoration of identity through recognition. This framework suggests that authentic homecoming requires not simply physical arrival, but the reconstruction of social relationships through demonstrated continuity of character and purpose. The epic's treatment of identity formation emphasizes recognition as the primary mechanism for establishing authentic selfhood. Throughout his journey, Odysseus's identity remains provisional until validated through others' acknowledgement. This epistemological structure suggests that individual identity emerges through social interaction rather than autonomous self-determination, requiring community participation in the process of self-definition. The exploration of loyalty as moral foundation reveals Homer's sophisticated understanding of social cohesion. The contrast between faithful servants like Eumaeus and treacherous ones like Melanthius establishes loyalty as the fundamental virtue enabling civilized society. This moral framework suggests that social stability depends upon individuals' willingness to maintain commitments despite personal cost or alternative opportunities. The divine justice theme demonstrates Homer's theological sophistication in balancing human agency with supernatural intervention. The gods' active participation in human affairs suggests that moral order requires transcendent validation, while human characters' ethical choices determine their worthiness for divine favor. This complex relationship between human responsibility and divine authority creates a nuanced theological framework for understanding justice. The power of narrative to preserve truth emerges as a central epistemological concern. Odysseus's story gains authority not through historical verification, but through its capacity to illuminate universal human experiences. This artistic theory suggests that poetic truth transcends factual accuracy by revealing eternal patterns of human behavior and divine interaction. The cyclical structure of the narrative, beginning and ending with Odysseus as storyteller, creates temporal transcendence that elevates the story beyond historical specificity. This circular architecture suggests that authentic epic achieves immortality through repeated telling, each performance renewing the story's relevance for contemporary audiences. The wine-dark sea as recurring metaphor functions as more than descriptive enhancement. It represents the beautiful yet dangerous nature of human existence. This maritime imagery suggests that life itself constitutes a perpetual voyage through uncertain waters, requiring navigation skills, divine favor, and ultimate faith in the possibility of safe harbor. The marriage bed's symbolic significance extends beyond individual relationship to represent the rooted foundation necessary for social stability. Unlike portable possessions, this living architecture cannot be moved without destroying its essential nature, suggesting that authentic institutions require organic development rather than artificial construction. The bow's restoration to its rightful owner represents the return of legitimate authority after periods of disruption. This martial symbolism suggests that justice sometimes requires decisive action to restore proper order, while its subsequent peaceful storage indicates that violence should serve restoration rather than perpetuation of conflict. The hall's purification through fire and sulfur creates sacred space cleansed of contamination. This ritualistic process suggests that authentic restoration requires ceremonial acknowledgement of pollution's removal, creating renewed foundation for legitimate authority and proper social relationships. The story's universal applicability emerges through its archetypal structure rather than cultural specificity. The journey pattern, departure, trial, return, provides a framework for understanding all human development, suggesting that individual maturation requires temporary separation from familiar environments, followed by tested return with enhanced wisdom. The narrative's immortality through oral tradition demonstrates poetry's capacity to transcend temporal limitations. Each telling creates new life for the story, suggesting that authentic art achieves permanence through repeated performance rather than material preservation. This oral vitality creates living tradition that adapts to new circumstances while maintaining essential truth. The final gift of the story, transformation of suffering into meaning through artistic representation, suggests that narrative serves therapy, eutic as well as entertainment functions. By converting painful experience into shared story, the epic provides psychological resolution for both narrator and audience, creating community through mutual recognition of universal human struggles. The narrative's mythic dimension transcends historical specificity to achieve archetypal universality, positioning Odysseus's journey as paradigmatic of all human experience. This elevation from particular to universal creates what scholars term mythic consciousness, the recognition that individual stories participate in eternal patterns that define human existence across cultural and temporal boundaries. The cyclical nature of heroic narrative reflects ancient Greek understanding of time as repetitive rather than linear. Each telling of Odysseus's story constitutes not mere repetition, but renewal, suggesting that authentic myth achieves immortality through perpetual recreation. This cyclical temporality creates sacred time wherein past, present, and future converge in eternal simultaneity. The listener's identification with the hero's journey operates through psychological projection rather than literal imitation. The audience's vicarious participation in Odysseus's trials provides cathartic resolution for their own experiences of separation, struggle, and desired return. This therapeutic function suggests that mythic narrative serves psychological healing through symbolic representation of universal human conflicts. The wine-dark sea, as metaphor for unconscious experience, creates psychological depth that extends beyond maritime adventure. This aquatic symbolism represents the vast, mysterious realm of human interiority that must be navigated through courage, wisdom, and divine guidance. The sea's wine-dark quality suggests that unconscious depths possess both beauty and danger, requiring skilled navigation to avoid destruction. The concept of home as spiritual destination rather than geographical location creates philosophical profundity that transcends literal homecoming. Ithaca represents not merely Odysseus's island kingdom, but the psychological state of Integra, achieved through successful navigation of life's challenges. This symbolic geography suggests that authentic arrival requires inner transformation rather than external movement. The hero's final rest represents not cessation of activity, but achievement of inner peace through completed integration. This psychological resolution suggests that authentic heroism culminates not in perpetual action, but in the wisdom that enables peaceful existence. The hero's earned rest validates the principle that struggle serves ultimate tranquility rather than constituting an end in itself. The bed carved from living olive tree functions as symbol of organic growth rather than artificial construction. This botanical metaphor suggests that authentic achievements require natural development through time rather than forced creation. The tree's continued growth indicates that genuine accomplishments strengthen rather than deteriorate through temporal passage. The bow's peaceful storage represents the proper relationship between force and justice. While violence serves necessary functions in restoring order, its ultimate purpose lies in enabling peaceful existence. This martial philosophy suggests that authentic strength demonstrates itself through restraint rather than aggressive display. The hall's restored harmony creates sacred space where proper relationships can flourish. This architectural symbolism indicates that social order requires not merely external structure, but internal commitment to maintaining appropriate relationships. The palace's purification enables renewed hospitality that defines civilized society. The storyteller's immortality through narrative transmission demonstrates art's capacity to transcend mortality. While physical bodies perish, stories achieve eternal life through repeated telling. This artistic immortality suggests that authentic achievement lies in eating meaningful narrative that continues to illuminate human experience across generations. The eternal homecoming motif recognizes that human longing for return constitutes a permanent psychological condition rather than temporary circumstance. Every individual experiences metaphorical exile and seeks reunion with their authentic identity. This universal pattern suggests that the journey homeward represents the fundamental human quest for self-knowledge and integration. The transition towards sleep represents the natural culmination of narrative satisfaction. Like a well-told story that reaches its proper conclusion, consciousness naturally settles into peaceful rest when psychological needs have been met. This soporific effect suggests that authentic art serves not merely entertainment, but psychological completion. The dream realm as destination creates liminal space where conscious and unconscious experience converge. Sleep becomes not escape from reality, but deeper engagement with archetypal patterns that define human existence. This oniric dimension suggests that rest provides access to wisdom unavailable through waking consciousness. The eternal song continues in silence, suggesting that authentic narrative achieves completion through internalization rather than external expression. The story's deepest effects occur after its telling ends, when listeners integrate its wisdom into their own psychological development. This silent continuation validates the principle that art serves transformation rather than mere entertainment. The narrative's final dissolution into dream consciousness represents Homer's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between mythic narrative and psychological transformation. This liminal transition creates sacred space where the boundary between story and experience dissolves, enabling the listener's complete integration into the archetypal journey toward rest and resolution. The wine-dark sea, as metaphor for dream consciousness, transforms the maritime imagery from external adventure into internal voyage. This aquatic symbolism suggests that sleep constitutes navigation through unconscious depths, where mythic patterns achieve their most profound psychological effects. The sea's wine-dark quality indicates that dream consciousness possesses both beauty and mystery, requiring gentle guidance rather than forceful navigation. The rhythm of waves as heartbeat creates physiological synchronization between natural processes and narrative cadence. This somatic integration suggests that authentic storytelling achieves its effects through bodily resonance rather than mere intellectual comprehension. The oceanic rhythm provides meditative framework that enables consciousness to settle into peaceful acceptance. The eternal nature of homecoming recognizes that psychological return constitutes a perpetual possibility rather than singular achievement. Within dream consciousness, every individual can access the archetypal pattern of successful navigation toward rest and integration. This universal accessibility suggests that mythic narrative provides psychological resources available to all human experience. The listener's joining with eternal return creates participatory mythology, wherein audience members become active participants in the heroic journey. This identificatory process enables personal transformation through symbolic participation in archetypal patterns. The merger of individual consciousness with universal story creates healing synthesis that transcends personal limitation. The bed of stories as resting place transforms narrative space into psychological sanctuary. Within this imaginative realm, consciousness finds refuge from daily concerns through engagement with eternal patterns that provide meaning and resolution. This narrative sanctuary suggests that authentic art serves therapeutic functions through symbolic representation of psychological wholeness. The olive tree's growth in dream consciousness represents organic development that continues beyond waking awareness. This botanical symbolism suggests that authentic transformation occurs gradually through natural processes rather than forced change. The tree's living foundation indicates that psychological growth requires rooted stability rather than superficial modification. The bow's silence represents the completion of justice through achieved peace. In dream consciousness, the necessity for struggle dissolves into acceptance of natural order. This martial resolution suggests that authentic strength achieves its purpose through establishing conditions for tranquil existence rather than perpetual conflict. The Hall of Memory as dwelling place creates sacred architecture wherein all stories achieve eternal presence. This imaginative space suggests that consciousness can access archetypal wisdom through dream engagement with mythic narrative. The hall's eternal nature indicates that authentic art transcends temporal limitations through psychological permanence. The deepest sleep as journey's end represents the ultimate homecoming, wherein individual consciousness merges with universal peace. This final dissolution suggests that authentic rest emerges through surrender to natural processes rather than willful control. The eternal silence contains all stories, providing the ultimate sanctuary for consciousness seeking resolution. The wine-dark dream embraces all wanderers, offering eternal homecoming through mythic participation in archetypal patterns that define human experience and provide pathway to transcendent peace